Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I just wanted to start by saying how deeply sorry I am to all of those who lost loved ones, family members through the pandemic, and also all those who suffered.
At the end of anyone's time, the most you can hope is to give your loved one a good death. And we will forever carry the guilt that our daddy was denied that.
When we locked down at work, I said we need to take this seriously to my chief executive. We're going to know people that die from this. But I never thought for a minute of being my dad and my sister 5 days apart.
It was hard. It was hard for so many people. I think everybody suffered somehow.
So that was Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister, and some of those who lost loved ones in the pandemic. And you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Yuan. So you heard there some of the harrowing stories from people during the pandemic. The COVID inquiry returns today to look at how the crisis affected patients, healthcare workers and the wider NHS. And for the first time, the stories of more than 30,000 healthcare staff, patients and relatives will form part of the material entered into evidence.
Now, the campaign group Transparency International UK has a report out today looking at the COVID procurement contracts, and it says that 135 contracts worth more than £15 billion raise red flags and indicate a high risk of corruption, which tells us a story, doesn't it, Yuan? Because on the one hand, you've got that the government, when it wants something, can find this magic money tree and find these colossal sums of money. But the other story it tells us is that there is some truth, perhaps, to the sheer amount of government waste.
Well, let's discuss the report now with the Chief Executive of Transparency International UK, Daniel Bruce. Daniel, thanks for joining us on the programme today. Just talk us through the problems you found in your report.
Thank you. Hello to you both. So we, over the last year or so, analysed forensically 5,000 government contracts, procurement contracts that were issued during the COVID-19 crisis, right up to the start of 2023. And those 5,000 contracts total £45 billion in public expenditure. And that £15 billion that you've described already is the amount, almost a third of it, that we identify as having contracts that display 3 or more possible red flags for corruption, and the details of which we've now shared with the Serious Fraud Office, the National Audit Office and others, asking for a fuller forensic investigation on a contract-by-contract basis. And our assessment is that this was very much a symptom of weak procurement rules and regulations going into the pandemic, but also political choices that were made by the government of the day that, far from increasing our defences against corruption and public waste in an emergency, actually reduced them.
So do you think that donating to a political party should exclude you from government contracts?
Not explicitly, no, but it has to be taken into consideration in the contracting process. That is one of the 14 red flags that we would have identified. If you had a political donor who then, for example, used his or her access to the so-called VIP lane for so-called high priority procurement treatment, which itself was found to be unlawful 2 years ago, having only maybe set up a company less than 100 days ago to supply PPE, which is what the majority of this money was spent upon, only then not to deliver it. And there are numerous examples like that in our research, in the sample that we've sent to authorities today. And it's those cases where all of those red flags come together, where it looks like there was possible under-delivery, where it looks like there was essentially an abuse of power by those who were in a position to influence government and to seek to sell their goods and services and may have not delivered. Those are the most egregious cases where arguably there may be a case for clawback or there should be other consequences for individuals involved.
I mean, it might seem obvious in hindsight, but it all sounds a bit grey zone, doesn't it? I mean, where's the line between patronage and corruption?
I think what we saw in the UK's response is an approach that really casts the UK as an outlier, where those political choices that I've described opened the door to cronyism and, yes, forms of patronage as part of that as well. The VIP lane is something that we cannot find any other similar example of anywhere in the world in the way that the government responded to the pandemic, and the sustained use of the direct awarding of contracts for these extraordinary amounts of public money just went on and on for months after month after month, well into years. Whereas, for example, all of the member states of the EU 27 had rapidly abandoned direct contracting in pursuit of more public transparency and accountability. So I guess patronage is one potential aspect of all of this, but really what you see here is a pattern of systemic weakness and poor choices leading to poor outcomes that were sustained over an extraordinary period of time.
I'm just casting my mind back to those awful early weeks of the pandemic when nurses and doctors were short of PPE. The whole world was scrambling to buy the same supplies. Would it really have been right for the government to just carry on with this normal procurement process? I mean, surely you're not suggesting that they take 6 months and make sure everything was lined up correctly.
No, not at all. And this is the point that needs to be taken forward by the new government. We need an overhaul of our emergency procurement systems, because that was part of the systemic weakness at the outset, is that, for example, there were not emergency frameworks of pre-approved suppliers that could rapidly shift large volumes of PPE in a volatile hot market in a crisis, which is why mechanisms like the VIP, arguably why mechanisms like the VIP lane and other measures were set up in a bit of a fumbled response. There will be other public emergencies. We know that, whether they're climate-induced or public health emergencies, that we need a better response to. We could have been better before we started, and we need much stricter controls when we do use those emergency mechanisms. There was such weak parliamentary oversight of all of this, which is one of the reasons why we've had to go ahead and produce this report to sort of create a retrospective look back at everything that went wrong. But if you introduce, for example, one of our recommendations, if you introduce these emergency measures, there should be an automatic sunset clause after 60 days, and Parliament, rather than the executive, should approve the process of renewing it on emergency grounds. There are simple measures that the new government could take to make all of this much safer in the future.
And can you just expand a bit on what else you'd like to see put in place if for instance, we find ourselves in another pandemic situation and another global race to buy PPE or vaccines or whatever? What are the things that need to be in place for that to work better?
Well, as I said, we would recommend that there are properly established frameworks that are established in peacetime, if you like, that tenders are put out for emergency response procurement, so that if there is an emergency of this kind, government can rapidly mobilise such frameworks and have these suppliers moving goods within 2 to 3 days, for example. Again, that all needs to be protected with proper parliamentary oversight, with a sunset clause on the use of emergency powers and justification to Parliament for extending them beyond an initial period. And there's also a huge amount of work to do around improving the way that government data and records around contracting are kept. There are numerous examples in our report where you still can't actually get to the bottom of, say, individual contracts where there are 3 or 4 different records sitting in different parts of government listing different figures for how much the contract was actually worth. And so this points to a very outdated system that's lacking central discipline in public procurement, that also needs to be improved, and that needs to be transparent and fast to build public confidence in an emergency. And that is perfectly possible. We saw that happening elsewhere in the world, in countries like Ukraine, with far weaker economies than the UK's, were publishing all of their contracts within 24 hours, whereas the UK was taking over a year in some cases. Okay,
so specific lessons being learned on procurement, but I do want to come back to this broad question about the difference between patronage and corruption, or cronyism as you put it, because there have been accusations of Labour cronyism from some parts of the press. Now, I wonder whether you would like to see reforms and what they would be, for instance, to the appointments process.
Yes, all of this in the pandemic was really one of these microcosms that shows how our other institutional safeguards against patronage, against corruption, against cronyism, we may use a range of other euphemisms if we like, are incredibly weak. Because, for example, a lot of the drip of scandal that we saw during the pandemic revolved around certain ministerial choices and ministerial conduct. And it revealed time and again that the conventions-based good chaps theory of government for upholding standards and integrity in our highest offices in the land doesn't always work anymore.
And would you say we're seeing more of the same under Labour?
Well, I think that Labour has, obviously talked a tough talk on standards and integrity. They promised an ethics and integrity commission. They promised a COVID corruption commission, and they need to get on and deliver those things. And they also, having done that, need to tread with exceptional care if, as we've seen, political donors appointed to certain roles in the early days of government. That absolutely needs to follow existing due process, and process that needs to be tightened up further in the future. And we said that under the last government, and it still needs tightening up today. So the new government needs to be very, very careful that it doesn't make simple mistakes that may be well-intentioned because it wants people involved in its election campaign around it in key roles, but absolutely due process needs to be followed, and they need to deliver on the commitments they've made in this area.
Keir Starmer's talked repeatedly about zero tolerance of corruption and a fresh start for government standards. Do you think they've put enough things in place in actual terms to achieve that?
Well, not yet, no. And actually, I think we would rather see this done well and robustly with care rather than rushed through. Certain mechanisms like an ethics and integrity commission that they promised, if done well, would need a statutory underpinning and therefore would need primary legislation to bring it into effect. The Prime Minister has already made some modest improvements, for example, giving his ethics advisor, the advisor on the ministerial code, the independence to launch his or her own investigations into suspected breaches of the code rather than relying on permission from the Prime Minister, as has always been the case in the past. There have been these little incremental steps, which are a welcome step in the right direction. But with a very busy intro for a new government, they mustn't lose sight of the much bigger picture that they've set out in their manifesto commitments in this area.
Daniel, great to get to your thoughts on this. That's Daniel Bruce, Transparency International UK's Chief Executive. Should just add the response from the Conservatives. They say that government policy was in no way influenced by the donations the party received. They are entirely separate.
OK, well, we will continue to follow the inquiry, and great to speak to Daniel there. But Yuan, that's all we've got time for today.
Yeah, if you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Meredith Frank. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Yuan Potts. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.